Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat, hosted by the Library Company of Philadelphia. My name is Fran Dolan. I am the Director of Operations for the Library Company, and I am excited to have all of you here tonight and to have our guest. Tonight's talk is called Men is Cheap, Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America with Professor Brian Luskey. So welcome again to the Library Company of Philadelphia. For those of you who don't know, we are an independent research library located in Center City, Philadelphia, concentrating primarily on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th centuries. We have an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is primarily to foster scholarship in all sorts of ways, some of which is programming, like you're going to be experiencing tonight. And a big reason that we're able to do that is through our shareholding and membership program, which is actually a super cool program. The founders of the Library Company, way back in 1731, created a finite number of shares of the Library Company, some of which are still available today. So if you're interested in membership and shareholding, we can match you up with one that kind of suits your interests. You can find out all about who owned it prior to you. I am shareholder number 1030, and I think it's really fascinating to learn about the 7 people before me who have owned it over time. So if you're interested in learning more about the Library Company and the shareholding program, check out our website, librarycompany.org. But the real star of tonight's show is our guest tonight, Brian Luskey. Brian Luskey is a professor of history at West Virginia University, where he teaches a variety of courses about 19th century United States. He is the author of 2 books, Men is Cheap, Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America, University of North Carolina Press, 2020, and On the Make, Clerks and the Quest for Capital in 19th Century America, New York University Press, 2010. He's also the co-editor with Wendy Woloson of Capitalism by Gaslight, Illuminating the Economy of 19th Century America. Portions of that were also featured in a Library Company exhibition many years ago. So welcome to the Library Company, Brian. It's great to see you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say tonight.
Okay, thank you, Fran. I appreciate it. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Looks great.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Fran and Allison, for having me back virtually to the Library Company. It's a very special place for me. Those 2 books that you mentioned, Fran, were books that I did a lot of research at the Library Company for. Happy end of semester and happy holidays to all of you who have tuned in to listen. I'll be talking tonight about some characters from my recent book, this one, Men is Cheap, Exposing the Frauds of Free Labor in Civil War America, which was published by UNC Press in 2020. I am contractually and maybe thematically obligated to make this pitch to you. It's for sale right now at a 28% discount on a website that rhymes with Shamazon. So act now, buy to save, just in time for the holidays. That's where my shameless self-promotion ends. And now I want to talk about these shameless guys. Let's see. There we go. These were the bounty men, the ruthless substitute or bounty brokers with whom I start my book. They spirited men into the military service of the United States during the Civil War, often by false pretenses. Northerners denounced them for it, and yet their condemnations of brokers' unethical conduct also obscure the significance of these men and the transactions they made. In Men is Cheap, I examine the activities of labor brokers more generally and the broader cultural conversation about them in order to illuminate the ways capitalism and the Civil War, the 2 most important transformative forces in 19th century American life, shaped each other. In these photographs, the brokers huddle outside their office. Appealing and deceiving advertisements like the one in the image on the left resembled the commercial advertisements of the day. You can see here 2 1861 advertisements from the McAllister collection at the Library Company. They were printed by the same Philadelphia printer with the same images of soldiers, flag, and commander, one to sell goods at war prices in Enon, Pennsylvania, northwest of Pittsburgh. Come on, volunteers and ladies, don't be backward. You can get good deals because I'm trying to offload goods cheaply and quickly in an unstable economy at the beginning of the war. I'll even try to get you excited by lying that we've retaken Fort Sumter. The same images are being used on the right to persuade soldiers to enlist. $2 cash in hand and $100 bounty at the end of the war. By 1865, when these bounty men were photographed, the recruitment posters promised hundreds of dollars in bounty payments to men who agreed to enlist. Financial inducements had been part of Union recruitment efforts since the beginning of the war, but they became more essential as the conflict continued. The number of volunteers waned, and the government's desperation for soldiers increased. Monetary considerations were central to conscription as well. The March 1863 Enrollment Act included a commutation clause that allowed drafted men either to pay $300 to release them from service or to find a substitute. Critics believed the legislation favored the rich because not all drafted men had $300. But in September of 1863, reeling from a summer of riotous opposition to the draft, President Abraham Lincoln defended commutation in an unpublished memorandum. Without the money provision, he reasoned, competition among the more wealthy might and probably would raise the price of substitutes above $300, thus leaving the man who could raise only $300 no escape from personal service. And Lincoln's statement proved prescient. In July 1864, bowing to criticism and noting that too many drafted men were paying the fee rather than serving or getting a substitute, Congress repealed commutation. The labor market for soldiers became fiercely competitive as draftees sought to hire men at escalating rates to do the job of killing and dying for them. Brokers managed these transactions and profited from this competition. One member of this despised breed, George Northrop, wrote a breathless letter to his employers, John Fay and Richard Dalton, on January 5th, 1865. It's this letter, and this gives us a sense of their business. Gents, I learned last night that the 15th district is filled. They're quoted with credits of 3 years men that comprises Washington and Rensselaer counties. And I also learned that the 16th district is filled also. And I fear that the most of the state is the same way. Men is cheap here today. 3-year subs, $700 to $800. I think that we will get a call for 500,000 men by the 1st of March, but not but a few men will be wanted this time. If I can find any place for men, I will come down soon. And if not, won't come down at all on this call unless you want me to come and help you to sell. And if you do, let me know. Fay and Dalton were recruitment brokers for the United States military and had an office in Brooklyn, New York, near the Naval Rendezvous and other points at which men were mustered into the service. Northrop was their agent upstate, writing from Troy. The firm had information about how many men had presented themselves as potential substitutes. Northrop had information about the extent to which congressional districts had filled the quotas stipulated in the latest draft call. Northrop's news was grim for the brokers. The communities of the Hudson River Valley, from just south of Albany north to Lake George, had filled their quotas, depressing prices in this market. Men was cheap because Northrop found it difficult to sell town commissioners the scraps of paper known as credits, on which brokers scrawled the names of substitutes who had enlisted in the metropolis, but were to be counted toward draft quotas elsewhere. In slow times like these, Northrop could only offer his willingness to find other chances to make deals or his labor to sell credits to town commissioners who visited headquarters in Brooklyn. Or he could put stock in rumors that President Lincoln would in short order make a draft call for 500,000 men. Then business would be big again. This business operated in ways that would not have seemed strange to contemporaries. Northrop's letter resembles the financial quotations page of the 19th century newspaper, citing prices and making prognostications about the market. Northrop's vision of a future in which credits and men would be bought and sold in volume seems a hopeful dream, but dreams, rumors, best guesses, and even facts could move 19th century markets up and down. We know about Northrop's letter because this business was rife with fraud. In February of 1865, War Department Detective Lafayette C. Baker arrested 27 recruitment brokers who operated in and around New York City. In doing so, he exposed a network of ambitious men engaged in a coordinated effort to forge enlistment documents and pocket the proceeds of enlistment payments. Armed with prices current, access to information along telegraph wires, and money to grease palms, brokers manipulated the movement of men to their benefit. The fraud in this market resembled the dissembling found in other markets. The brokers filled blank credit forms with fake names, evoking the bookkeeping and accounting fraud pervasive among commercial clerks. They mimicked slave auctioneers by hiding evidence of recruits' disease and physical infirmities from doctors. They adopted the tactics of runners of counterfeit currency, taking men who had failed medical examinations in one location from town to town until they found surgeons willing to vouch for their health and provost marshals willing to accept them. Brokers boasted to one another that they could put anything in the army in the shape of man. But they didn't just talk a good game. They were brazen thieves, lubricating substitutes with alcohol in taverns that were sometimes adjacent to recruitment rendezvous in order to steal enlistment payments. Many substitutes woke up with a hangover and only a dim recollection of how they got to camp. Brokers told their marks to wait in another room while they got their payment from the recruiter. They would then give substitutes a part of the money owed to them and explain that they would get the rest in installments. Brokers would then vanish with the lion's share of the proceeds, confident that families of enlisted men would not have the information, the gumption, or the power to apprehend them. And theft could be hidden by money laundering. Fay and Dalton took at least $20,000 of their profits from this lucrative trade, and in a statement of their abiding patriotism, surely bought U.S. bonds. And they weren't alone. Look at these brokers posing under the waving Star-Spangled Banner. Americans hated these brokers, perhaps because they needed them so. Both drafted men and potential substitutes needed information to find each other in an anonymous market for labor. But making money out of war has always provoked Americans' condemnation. Kings and queens had long employed mercenaries and kept standing armies, but Republican citizenship called on Americans to defend their imperiled nation and the ideals for which it stood. Historians have chronicled the ideological rationale for Northern men to go to war in 1861, defending the Constitution, the Union, democracy, and maybe participating in a process of emancipation were all ideological motivations that encouraged men to enlist. These issues allowed soldiers to highlight their civic virtue by demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice for the common good rather than gain at the public's expense. Yet Americans' concerns about war profiteers existed alongside concerns about the economic system of wage labor that made citizens dependent. For mercenary also meant hireling, and these were two of the dirtiest words in 19th century America. Soldiering was wage labor. Northerners believed that Union soldiers would do the work of destroying an aristocracy, a disloyal slaveholding class that threatened the world's last bastion of liberalism, an ideology that emphasized not only individual political rights, but also individuals' economic freedom to compete in the market. The ideological reasons that inspired Northerners to go to war to validate their notions of Republican citizenship coexisted uneasily with the fact that becoming soldiers meant becoming hirelings dependent on state and federal governments for survival. That uneasiness crept its way into images like the one you see here from the winter of 1863 in the publication Vanity Fair. Titled 6 Months in Arrears, the Army of the Potomac was supposed to be paid every 2 months, but had not been paid for 6. The caption read, "God help the little ones at home," as their father braced himself against the harsh elements in the service of the nation. Now, President Lincoln saw value in the work he called Northern men to do. In his July 1861 message to Congress, he not only justified his recruitment policies, but also asked representatives and senators to volunteer their support. Place at the control of the government for the work of war, he requested, at least 400,000 men and $400 million. Explaining that these totals were mere fractions of the male population and wealth of the country, he claimed that a right result at this time will be worth more to the world than 10 times the men and 10 times the money. The war's capital costs would be awesome, but the preservation of the Union would be priceless because its form of government best served, quote, to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life, end quote. If the nation dedicated to Republican principles spent its capital now, it would help its citizens earn capital for generations to come. Lincoln tried to untangle the conundrum that soldiers faced. The war would, he argued, contribute to the triumph of free labor. Soldiers would be dependent for a time, but would do the work necessary to save the nation and its principles, bolstered by the North's considerable capital. Northern citizen soldiers, however, often found that their place in the war's economy forced them to scramble for the credit and capital that would ensure their own survival while they fought for the nation's survival. After the passage of a May 1861 law providing volunteers with a $100 federal bounty at the end of their term of service, all Northern soldiers were bounty men. And in a wage labor economy, Union soldiers came to understand that personal autonomy could only be earned and validated by peers through the control of other people's labor. In my book, I discuss many soldiers and officers who came to realize this, but I'm going to focus here on one of them, Henry Walker, a 37-year-old laborer from Forestport, New York, north of Utica, who enlisted as a private in the 117th New York Infantry in August 1862. In his enlistment contract, Walker agreed to accept such bounty pay, rations, and clothing as are or may be established by law for volunteers. Oneida County's Board of Supervisors voted to raise $162,700 on the credit of the county in order to pay a $50 local bounty to each soldier recruited for the regiment. Walker and his comrades would also receive $50 from the state of New York, $100 from the federal government, with 25 of those dollars due upon their enlistment, 1 month's wages of $13 in advance, and the $2 hand money for recruiting a soldier. So before they left their home county, these New Yorkers were supposed to have $140 in cash available to them and their families, and a promise of $75 more from the federal bounty after they were mustered out of the service. The beginning of the war proved to be a time of economic crisis for Walker and his family. unsettling both the material basis for his family's survival and the ways he thought about independence and success. His household was imperiled by the demands the war placed upon it. The 1860 federal census shows that he owned land valued at $500. Economic panic early in the war likely played some role in driving him from the rank of farmer into that of laborer, the occupational designation on his enlistment papers. His 16-year-old son, Albert, had enlisted in the wake of Fort Sumter and had died of typhoid fever in camp. By August 1862, when Henry Walker went to war, his wife Persis and their 6 daughters, the oldest was 15, the youngest 6, resided on rented land. As he settled into quarters near Washington, Henry wrote to Persis to let her know that he was hungry and that his knapsack had been pilfered by a comrade in arms. Surrounded by thieves, Walker might have been forgiven if he had given up, but he took his obligations to heart, writing to his family that his purpose as a soldier was to defend your rights to the best of my abilities. The nation's political and military crisis would be intertwined with his and his family's economic one. He suggested that free labor's promise was available to all and among the rights he would defend. I wish you to prosper one and all, he proclaimed. Remember, your life is just what you make it. He sounds like Ben Franklin's Poor Richard in these letters. Self-reliance was necessary in hard times if the Walkers were going to get ahead as a household. The odds of them achieving prosperity seemed long. Despite the state's promise, Henry was still expecting the state bounty every day, some 2 months after he had enlisted. Yet faced with the challenge of alleviating his family's economic struggles, Henry Walker resolved to work harder and envisioned a future in which he and his loved ones were in control of their economic destiny. Despite their circumstances, he did not believe that mere survival would be their lot. He was looking to make something of himself and his family. But nothing was in his control from his camp in Washington. So all he could think of doing was mansplaining to his wife and daughters. Buy pork, especially near killing time when it would be cheapest. Don't buy frivolous daguerreotype likenesses to send. Watch that man Hewitt. If he was the one to float the hay to market, he will take the advantage of you if he can. He may get it wet and spoil it. It will be very poor stuff if it is wet. In November, Henry told Persis that he did not expect to be paid before the new year. He asked her to send him $2, perhaps from the money she had earned by marketing agricultural produce, so that he could buy a pair of gloves that would warm his hands while he dug rifle pits to strengthen the capital's fortifications. Instead, Persis bought the gloves herself. She could obviously get them for less than $2. So Henry received those gloves and a dollar bill in about 3 weeks. Persis sure could economize. You must get along as well as you can until I get some money, Henry wrote Persis in December, almost 4 months after he had enlisted. But mansplaining aside, she already was. He told her how he was getting along as best he could by purchasing shoemaker tools and going to work repairing his comrades' shoes. An entrepreneur who had tools and raw materials could make money from soldiers who out of necessity needed to repair and reuse old items because they couldn't afford to buy new ones. Conveying optimism about his endeavors, Henry urged Persis to ask neighbors to envision the Walkers' prosperous future too. Believing he would be paid around the first of the year, he wanted Persis to trade on that state bounty that he had yet to be paid. That is, he wanted her to promise creditors that when she got the bounty, she would pay them. As a line of credit with neighbors, the bounty might help the Walkers create the independent future for which they worked and dreamed. Even though their finances were precarious, they sought financial means to make more independence. Walker was eventually able to send some money home from what he earned as a soldier and cobbler. Back home in Forestport, though, Percis's economic position remained uncertain, and Henry knew this. So he sought to boost her spirits by extolling more Franklinian virtues. Our course in life depends on our own energy. Persevere. There is nothing like try again. He saw signs that the nation and all its people would prosper. There is a great time a-coming when all those that live to see it will enjoy the best government that ever was. If I do not enjoy it, my family will, and thousands of poor souls that never knew what freedom was. Walker would be an exemplar of the manhood demanded of volunteers. He would, through discipline and self-sacrifice, help to save the Republic. Now that President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Walker incorporated the rights of slaves into the cause of defending the Union. Yet for all of free labor's platitudes about impending advancement and Walker's trust in their efficacy, his anxieties festered in his correspondence as he cataloged his ambitions and vented his frustrations to Persis, who gamely persisted by navigating an economy defined by scarcity and transactions with stingy neighbors and storekeepers. But then, as he surveyed the crumbling society of the slave South from a new vantage point in Yorktown, Virginia, in July 1863, Henry dreamed of another way he and Persis could achieve independence. After spending a day guarding the property of a Virginia plantation owner who had recently sworn allegiance to the United States, he mused upon the value of the African-American women he called wenches, who toiled in the planter's berry garden and cabbage patch. "I'm going to bring home one to do the work for you," he told Persis. "They are so black and shiny that you would like to have one to work for you," he explained. Walker hated this Southern slaveholder for helping to inaugurate the war and then hypocritically claiming the fruits of loyalty to the United States. Walker supported slave emancipation, but he also believed that competing and succeeding in the wage labor economy meant taking advantage of people when you could. Workers who could perform arduous tasks like the women in the supposedly repentant farmer's field enticed Northern soldiers like Walker. The rebels' disloyalty disqualified him from deserving these workers anymore. The women's black and shiny appearance represented their desirability as workers who would make the Walkers' home respectable and supplement Henry and Persis's efforts to obtain a comfortable living. The way the war had rocked the Walker household, Albert's death, Henry's persevering extra work and struggle to get paid, and Persis's trouble with creditors, made the ideal of domesticity difficult to attain. The capacity of Black women to do labor that produced sweat and caused their skin to glisten in the hot sun was, according to the logic of free labor, the very thing that would underwrite the Walkers' ambitious vision of household independence. Henry did not make this dream come true. He died in 1864 of wounds he sustained at Petersburg. But his desire for African-American laborers was a common dream shared by Northern contemporaries and by the US government. In my book, I examine the efforts of white Northerners to move African-American men willingly and unwillingly into the armed forces, and African-American women and children, mostly unwillingly, to Northern cities to work in white people's homes. These efforts were all founded on white Northerners' understandings that the freedoms of free labor mostly accrued to employers, not workers. There we go. But let me return to Baker's investigations of substitute fraud in New York City. These bounty brokers were not the only speculators the detective encountered. The other participants in that market, substitutes and their wives, hoped it could create value for them. That is what they gambled on. Substitutes were often victimized by bold, brazen fraud. Journalists and artists sought to create social types that would help readers understand what happened in the market. In this 1863 Harper's Weekly cartoon, the intrepid soldier and the virtuous soldier's wife on the top and left are juxtaposed with a swindling contractor and his wife on the bottom and right of the images of this image. These types would help distinguish those who speculated from those who sacrificed and were sacrificed. The swindlers were real, but the social types obscure as much as they reveal. Baker's investigations show the strategies, preparation, and hard work of ordinary people as much as their suffering at the hands of brokers. Substitutes and their families thought they had a friend in Lafayette Baker, and they speculated about substitute fraud because the state might help them claw their way to survival in an economy that limited their access to resources. The testimony that Baker heard illuminates people's ambitions for a better life as they struggled to survive the Civil War. Substitute hire was a new opportunity to make household economies more solvent and their members less dependent. Some substitutes directed recruiters to pay their hire to third parties to whom they owed money. Sometimes that third party put the man up to it. That is, he acted as a broker. But these instances show the ways men use this market to alleviate financial pressure on their households when they would not have been able to do so otherwise. Soldiers' wives and mothers called on paternalistic aid from Baker and the government, relying on cultural scripts that they had hoped would create sentimental ties with the clerks and officers listening to their testimony. They lived by what their husbands and sons could earn, and without their support, they had nowhere else to turn. The testimony that Baker's clerks copied shows that women struggled for survival against a variety of men, brokers, army officers, and relatives who had the ability to make their lives difficult. Women and their allies coupled stories of destitute circumstances and appeals for help with tales about male relatives who withheld husband's substitute hire from them. One woman feared that the $500 her husband had been paid was lost forever, drowned at the bottom of her brother-in-law's whiskey bottle. Brokers challenged women to prove that they were married to soldiers who were owed payments and hid behind vague assertions about what Army regulations said they owed. Both were tactics that imperiled the welfare of wives and children in the absence of breadwinning husbands and fathers. Ambitious sons might do the same, their heads turned by the prospect of earning a sum of money that vastly exceeded their yearly wages. Struggling to make ends meet, these men were as susceptible to the call from substitute brokers as they were to pitches made by employers who offered high wages. Making decisions about their careers without the knowledge or permission of parents could separate young men from their protectors and devastate the family economy all at once. Just as often, women flipped the paternalistic script. Like Persis Walker, they were central figures in family economies. They found out what was theirs and demanded it from men. Some appear to have learned about the substitute market by surprise, after receiving a letter from a husband or son informing them that they had enlisted or been duped into enlisting. This news was especially hard to hear because family survival was often predicated on men's, women's, and children's combined earning power, and now women not only lost their men's wages, but work time of their own as they retraced the steps of husbands and sons back through the market in order for the family to benefit from the payment owed to them. Jane Wilsey was one of these women. Her husband, Jacob, telegraphed to ask her to venture from the family home in Brooklyn to Trenton, New Jersey, where he had been sent after joining the army in Newark as a substitute. He hoped she would get my money, for I can't draw it myself, after being sent to Virginia 3 days after enlisting. Upon arriving in Trenton and speaking to an officer there, Jane Wilsey discovered that the Army would not let her have the money either, since her husband could, quote, draw it in the Army himself. Undeterred by the conflicting information, Jane Wilsey returned to Newark and tracked down the man who had paid $900 to a broker named Meade to hire Jacob as a substitute. Jane confronted Meade's brother-in-law, who claimed not to know who it was that brought her husband to that office. She suspected that some foul play and great wrong had been committed, and after further sleuthing, put the argument to Baker that Meade had pocketed $400 that should be her family's. Baker's investigations into the fraudulent system potentially provided Jane Wilsey with a muscle that could obtain restitution, but she had done the detective work herself to determine how this market operated and how her household had been cheated. After Baker arrested substitute brokers and a lot of bounty jumpers in February and March 1865, he began to receive letters from family members proclaiming that their men were innocent and that these should be released from their confinement. They'd been at the wrong place at the wrong time. They had temporarily fallen in with bad men. It was probably just as well for Baker that the War Department ordered him back to Washington to assist in apprehending the assassins of the president. It was too difficult to determine what fraud was and who perpetrated it in each and every case. By the war's end, a few brokers had even started to impersonate Baker's detectives, accusing citizens of bounty jumping and demanding that they empty their pockets of money to make the accusations go away. Everyone agreed that fraud was everywhere and eminently adaptable. Everyone else was a mercenary or a hireling, just not me. Northerners condemned the substitute business as fraud at the same time that they failed to appreciate the ways it represented the wage labor market of their region in the 19th century. We may think that working men were gullible when they fell for broker stories about future payments and installments, but working people were not paid for jobs up front in this era. They often risked losing back pay if they did not give several weeks' notice to employers that they were quitting. This new market in substitutes seemed lucrative, but it was opaque in its operation. So they trusted people who claimed they had insider knowledge about how it worked. When substitutes discovered they had been cheated, they thought that Baker, a representative of the federal government, would assist them in reclaiming the windfall that was supposed to be the legitimate fruits of speculating in free labor, the money that might have led to a more stable economic outlook. Unfortunately, there were few cases in which Baker was able to recover money stolen from substitutes. Drafted men were dependent on the broker and his extortion too, but after they paid the brokers, their responsibilities ended. For women like Jane Wilsey, the con went on and on. No matter for the drafted man whom Wilsey encountered in Newark, he could rightly say that he didn't cheat her, she should blame the broker. The economic crisis of Civil War reveals that ambition and desperation, success and survival were all intertwined with each other. Civil War historians have long debated whether the phrase "a rich man's war and a poor man's fight" accurately describes the economic and social status of enlisted men. There isn't any scholarly consensus on this question, and in fact, the debate has obscured the complex economic processes that motivated and shaped the Norse war effort. Fought to uphold the ideal of free labor that prevailed in the loyal states, the Union War encouraged Northern entrepreneurs, employers, and soldiers to envision their impending success through the accumulation of capital. Like Henry Walker, they sought the independence that capital purchased by employing laborers whom the war had made vulnerable. The war seemed to offer some Northerners opportunities to get rich because it clarified that other Americans were poor. To appreciate the significance of the Civil War's economic crisis, we must continue to grapple with the fact that Henry Walker, in his vision of the African American women who would alleviate his wife's burden, and substitute brokers in their pitches for riches shared a common assumption among bounty men that men and women is cheap here. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Appreciate your listening.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was really interesting. Not a side of the Civil War that you hear about too often. So I have a question for you. I'm always interested in what leads researchers and historians down these particular roads. Do you mind talking a little bit about kind of how you got interested in this? I mean, there's anything you could do research in, and how'd you wind up here?
Sure. That edited collection I edited with Wendy Woloson, it really, drove me down a path toward looking at secondary markets, what you might call underground economies as well, and how these economies were so central to the way transactions function, the way the economy worked more generally, how they worked. And so I started to research labor agencies, which were called at the time intelligence offices. These were places where, especially in cities, and especially surrounding the household economy of domestic servitude, where potential domestic servants could find employment, and where mistresses of households could find laborers. And this institution was pretty pervasive in every American city of the 19th century. But intelligence office keepers were as hated as the substitute brokers I talked about. They were understood to cheat both workers and potential employers. They charged a fee. So when workers complained, well, you didn't get me a job, the intelligence office keeper would say, well, my hands are tied. There aren't many jobs available right now. Employers would say, I'm not satisfied with the quality of the people you're giving me to work for me. So that's the kind of conversation that's kind of, and it was pretty widespread, this cultural debate about the intelligence office in ways you wouldn't expect. But what surprised me is I started to look at this institution further and find that Americans used it as a model for the movement of laborers during the Civil War. They hated it so much that they depended upon it again and again and again. So that's how I started, and how the book came to be about the war. And as I talked about tonight, what Northerners said they fought for.
Interesting. All right, so we've got a question in the chat. It says, because of the ways that underground economies might be resistant to a paper trail in the 19th century and today, do you have a sense of where the gaps in the archive might be and what might exist in them? What do you wish you had been better documented in this area? Cool question.
That is a great question. I guess I'll talk not first about the archival silences, but the archival abundance, kind of surprisingly, or at least I found enough to go on for this book. There are great sources next door to you of intelligence offices kept by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, for which I was surprised to find that William Still actually served as an intelligence office agent for the old Abolition Society to manage the flow of formerly enslaved women and children coming up from the South and then being moved to Philadelphians' homes and homes out in the Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey countryside. So there are great records there of correspondence between prospective employers and the agency. There was also a group called the Union Volunteer Refreshment Saloon, which was created to offer food and lodging for soldiers coming through Philadelphia from the north on their way to battlefields in the South. But they came to process a great many Southern populations, including African Americans, including white refugees, and increasingly by the end of the war, Confederate deserters. So there there's an interest among Northern employers to give jobs to all of these people. And so I really dug deeply into those records. And then, as I said, crime, when it's discovered and when it's investigated, often produces a paper trail. So I was able to uncover a lot in the National Archives from Baker's records of his investigations into bounty fraud. So it's a great question. I guess I would say it wasn't one I had to deal with. I had a lot of sources to really draw from. I will say that the numbers of people mentioned in those sources at HSP amounted to maybe 900 or 1,000 people. And so I know from the ways in which William Still talks about it, is that there were many hundreds more coming up, and their kind of their experience was lost in part because they moved through the intelligence office so quickly. There was such demand for their labor that Still and other agents weren't able to write down anything about them. And one of Still's frustration was, I can't keep accurate records of where these folks are going.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good you were able to find so much.
Yeah,
it is all out there. It's remarkable how much material surfaces when you start to dig and where to look and the questions to ask. So, well, do we have any other questions?
I could add there that there's another kind of absence here, is that other historians, Michael Johnson and Leslie Schwalm, have written books and articles that mostly focus on the movement of African American refugees from the South to the Midwest. And Johnson's convinced through his, he has maybe more voluminous records than I do, that some 75 to 80,000 African Americans moved from South to North during the Civil War. So really, my book is really only based on a smaller sample, but it's one that really helps me trace the experiences of individuals moving from southern states through the U.S. Army and to these intelligence offices that brokered labor arrangements in and around northern cities.
Super interesting. Well, is there any other questions out there then, or anything else you would like to share with us, Professor Luskey?
Well, I'm starting to research a new book that kind of builds off of this, is really kind of digging deeper into the archive that Lafayette Baker produced, and reading that against his rather sensational history of the U.S. Secret Service that he wrote, and actually had a historian kind of ghostwrite for him in 1867, after he had been drummed out of the service as a detective. And when you read through these affidavits, this testimony in his investigations, you start to question Baker's certainties about the importance of the detective, and particularly him, in saving the Republic. So I'm kind of, doing a social and cultural history of the people in Baker's records, but talking about their experiences, to discuss economic motivation, to discuss loyalty and disloyalty, all the themes that are kind of central to the Civil War, but which brings these people out of the shadows in ways that Baker hadn't intended.
Sure. So we got a question in the Q&A from Ivan, who asked, excuse me, were intelligence offices in the countryside, such as Bucks County? Were they kind of spread around, or mainly in?
Not that I know of. So they're mainly urban institutions, but as I mentioned here, there are people writing from Bucks County and other surrounding counties around the city, saying things like, I heard from a neighbor of mine that I could get access to black laborers coming from the Confederacy. Is that true? and I have these requirements. I want someone who's 12 years old. I want someone, and they're really, really crazy and racist things like, I want one as black as can be. And that can be read along the lines of the evidence I provided about Henry Walker too. So there's definitely demand coming from employers in the countryside who are operating farms and want laborers both inside and outside their homes.
All right, so I think we got time for one last question. We got it over here. Question is, we can see clearly how these labor patterns drove identity-based divisions at the time. Do you have any evidence of solidarity between marginalized groups as a result of some of these forces?
That's a great question.
Yes.
And it kind of, I think what I'd say is that largely no. And so in some ways, this narrative that I'm telling in this book is kind of a parallel one to the work of Mark Laus and others who have talked about class formation and unionization during the war, where workers would see a common bond. I think I am recovering the motivations of those in the middle. People who are not yet employers but hope to be, and see the freedoms of free labor really being as employers, and that's the way to be independent, autonomous. I don't see. I mean, and I think we could understand this if you look at the intelligence office of the Union Volunteer Refreshment Saloon, where African American and white refugees from the South are milling about an office alongside Confederate deserters. You're liable not to have a lot of common bonds or interests there. There's going to be a lot of tension in the room.
I'm sure.
I would suspect. So I wouldn't say that certainly among African American refugees you would have a feeling of solidarity and feeling that independence could principally be won through collective means and collective goals rather than individual ambition, like a lot of the people that I'm talking about here. But I don't see that kind of that class cohesion or solidarity or class formation in these intelligence offices. There's just a lot of competition and desperation.
I'm sure. All right. Well, I think let's see, any other questions? So I think that's about it. So I want to thank you, Professor Luskey, so much. This was really interesting. It wasn't something that I knew much about, and it was interesting to see the light shed on that. I want to thank Allison Kronstadt behind the scenes making this happen. And I want to thank everyone out there for attending. We will be sending out a video to everyone who registered this evening. You should get it, I don't know, within a week or so. And then this is also pretty much our last program of the year. So I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year and enjoy the holidays. And thank you again, Professor Luskey. It was really great having you here.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thanks, Allison. And thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Happy holidays.
Good night, everyone.